Hello everyone, welcome to our project presentation. I will begin our presentation with an introduction. Ottawa is more than just Canada's capital. Beneath its government buildings and the scenic river lies the stories that go far deeper, stories tied to land, ceremony, and cultural memory. An autonomous transportation system named RobOttCab will be introduced to the city, offering smooth, efficient travel powered by Google Maps. These systems are optimized for convenience and speed. But in prioritizing simplicity, what might they leave out? The maps are precise, but are they complete? The routes are fast, but are we fully informed? This project explores what happens when design decisions unintentionally render some history invisible, and what it means when travelers follow the path but miss the place. Now, let's listen to the story about Lucas. Lucas, a tourist from Quebec, returns to Ottawa with a deeper intention, not just to see landmarks, but to connect with the city's Indigenous roots. He remembers his last trip when a taxi driver pointed to the Chaudière Falls and said, "That's our Kikonji Wan, sacred site for Algonquin people." That moment stayed with him. Now, years later, the city feels different, automated, efficient. He opens the app for RobOttCab, Ottawa's autonomous taxi service, hoping for a meaningful route. He scrolls through the options, but all he sees are practical settings. Avoid the tolls, highway, ferries, or choose a few efficient routes. No cultural heritage loop, no way to engage with the land's story or understand if it's a good idea to drive by them. He books a ride, the car glides smoothly. The screen shows a quiet map, a blue line, and an ETA. As they pass the Ottawa River, Lucas looks out. There it is, Aoki Kongji Wen. But the screen says owning Chaudière Falls. No voice, no context. He takes a photo, not to ask, but to remember. Something felt important but unspoken. Was he even supposed to be there? The maps gave him a path, but no context.
Thank you, Lubin. Using Lucas as a case and applying value-sensitive design, we examine how this new taxi and its navigation system may support or undermine human values, impact the stakeholder groups, and reflect the political context in which it operates. Although Google added over 3,000 Indigenous lands in Canada to its platforms, including maps, back in 2017, users still have limited control over route selection. Currently, they can only adjust routes to avoid tolls, highways, or ferries, or to prioritize fuel efficiency. This supports Stribling's point about engineers simplifying complex problems. The risk is designing technologies blind to the broader social implications of their work. From a utilitarian view, these features may seem justified as they maximize efficiency and user satisfaction. But as VSD reminds us, we must also consider those affected in less visible ways. To do this, we created a value map to visualize 5 key stakeholders. These were selected to reflect the balance of technical factors, institutional interests, and socially impacted communities, both directly and indirectly involved. Our goal was to help designers to build empathy and anticipate the social impacts of the RobOttCab taxi. We identified 2 direct stakeholders: the RobOttCab engineers, whose values focus on innovation, system reliability, transparency, fairness, inclusion, efficiency, ease of use, safety, comfort, and accountability, as they are responsible for the taxi's technical functionality. And RobOttCab as a corporation, which values operational efficiency, market trust, and accountability. It must ensure the system is profitable, regulation compliant, and aligned with the city and community expectations, especially through political negotiation. The company also promotes innovation and transparency. Binuri will continue with the indirect stakeholders.
The 3 indirect stakeholders are, first, the Indigenous communities, particularly for the Algonquin Nation in Ottawa, who have been historically marginalized and whose land and cultural sites are often overlooked in digital mapping systems. Second, newcomers and tourists who value ease of use, trust in navigation, efficiency, safety, comfort, and transparency, especially when it comes to understanding the cultural significance of the places they are routed through. And third, the Indigenous advocacy groups who work to ensure Indigenous perspectives are included in decisions where governments and technologies have yet to engage meaningfully. From this perspective, several value tensions emerged. One stood out, especially in relation to usability: the tension between ease of use and transparency, as experienced by Lucas. Transparency means that the navigation system should clearly explain how and why routes are chosen. including when they pass through or nearby culturally sensitive areas. But ease of use, particularly for the tourists and newcomers, relies on simplicity and minimal cognitive load when navigating or making adjustments. This leads to a core ethical question. How can robot cab designers enrich navigation systems like Google Maps to balance route efficiency for majority, while also being culturally accountable to Indigenous communities without compromising ease of use for all users? If this issue goes unaddressed, it can cause real harm like cultural erasure by rendering Indigenous presence invisible in everyday technologies, unintentional disrespect as users may pass through nearby sacred sites unknowingly, reinforcement of biased systems by embedding efficiency-first values that treat cultural sensitivity as optional, and reduce trust from both marginalized communities and ethically minded users.
One of the design tools that we have chosen is social failure mode analysis. As to why we have chosen this within the context of our ethical issue is that it focuses on social norms and how technologies succeed or fail by adhering to or violating them. It also helps map how Google Maps design choices create systematic harms by clashing with Ottawa's sociocultural fabric. The social norms that are at stake are respect for Indigenous sovereignty and consent indulging Indigenous communities, and cultural transparency for visitors and tourists who assume navigation systems provide accurate cultural context. Transparency versus ease of use is our primary value tension. Now, the scenario for the social context is that tourists rely on RobOttCab's app for navigation, but receive no alerts about sacred Indigenous sites. Norm interaction. Transparency deficit. Current design transgresses the norm of cultural transparency by omitting Indigenous land data. It also violates free, prior, informed consent, which is stated in UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights. Ease of use overemphasis. It prioritizes minimalistic UI, avoiding clutter to support norms of ethical exploration and cultural awareness. This table shows that apart from our primary value tension, social failure mode analysis also addresses the rest of the value tensions as well: efficiency versus cultural respect, system reliability versus ethical visibility, and consent versus innovation. They have their respective social failure modes and their respective harmful effects as well. Now, the key takeaways of this discussion is that SFMA exposes hidden ethical trade-offs by analyzing how technologies interact with social norms. Transparency versus ease of use is a moral failure, not just UX. Ignoring Indigenous data harms communities and misleads users. All tensions connect to SFMA's core premise: technologies break when norms are ignored.
I will discuss how we use ethics setting map to analyze and address ethical tension in RobotCab autonomous navigation system. Routine decisions may seem purely technical, but they actually involve embedded ethical choice, engineered to bring value judgment into technology, shaping how it interacts with society. In our case, Google Maps defaults to prioritize efficiency, but is very concerned. What if those road paths through Indigenous land disrupt circuit size or increase unwanted traffic? This review of key value tension, tourists and newcomers prefer it to use, while Indigenous communities prioritize transparency and consent over which roads affect them. Since routing involves invisible ethical judgment, we need a tool to make those judgments explicit. This is why we choose an ethics setting map. To apply this tool, we leverage on the insight provided by the value map and VSD approach. We found that the default navigation setting failed to consider Indigenous consent in routing decisions. Ethical AI decisions should be adjustable rather than fixed. We prototype 3 ethical navigation modes: standard mode, prioritizing speed; Indigenous awareness mode, highlighting cultural signs; and community-guided routing, allowing Indigenous community to define preferred paths. This aligns with the idea that AI-driven decisions shouldn't be rigid, but should allow user input based on ethical preference. Ethics setting map help us visualize trade-off, ensuring that small design choices don't lead to larger ethical consequences. Through this process, we learn that navigation isn't neutral. It enforces value, often prioritizing speed over cultural sensitivity. We also realize that user-selectable ethical settings are key. By allowing travelers to opt for culturally respectful routes, we balance efficiency with ethical awareness. Finally, ethics setting map expose bias in traditional navigation systems, ensuring Indigenous community actively participate in shaping it. In conclusion, this guiding us toward navigation system that is more inclusive, transparent, and ethically conscious.
Okay, thank you, Kate. Now I'll walk you through our prototype for the ethical navigation settings. This feature adds a simple interface to RobOttCab's app that lets users to choose how their ride interacts with indigenous lands. There are 3 routing modes, the standard mode offering the fastest route without any cultural context. The cultural awareness mode highlights indigenous sites and gives users optional info. And the community-guided mode avoids secret areas using routes developed by the indigenous communities. This design uses a familiar GPS-style interface, making it intuitive and easy to use. This directly tackles issues like cultural invisibility and lack of transparency. By making indigenous spaces visible in digital systems, it gives users meaningful ethical choice. It supports self-determination by involving indigenous voices in route design and helps reduce automation bias by encouraging the engagement, just like Miller proposed in his ethical setting model. That said, there are still challenges. First, deciding which site to include requires careful consideration. We want to avoid tokenism or misrepresentation. Second, too many options might confuse the users, especially tourists unfamiliar with indigenous contexts. We also need to test, will people actually choose ethical routes? Does this improve cultural awareness? And most importantly, do indigenous communities feel properly represented? To conclude, Lucas' story reminds us that a smooth ride can still missing something important. The RobOttCab may move people efficiently, but without ethical design, it risks erasing indigenous stories. Thank you. This is the end of our presentation. And here are references that support our work.